This is Identity at the Center.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and I'm flying solo today. Jim's off, enjoying, I believe, somewhere in Alaska cruise. So kudos to him for being able to get out of the office and do stuff like that. Today, we've got a sponsor spotlight episode. So this is a series, as many of you know, IDAC is a nonprofit, and episodes like this are what makes it possible to do what we do here. And so generous supportive organizations that do that for us is very cool. They believe in the IAM community that we're building here. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in it today. Our sponsor today is P0 Security. If you want to find out more information about them and our conversation today, you can go to p0.dev/IDAC. And if that sounds familiar, it's because P0 was with us last year. Around August of this time, it was episode 368. We had Shashwat Sagal on, and shout out to my friend Shashwat. I remember seeing him, I think it was a couple months ago at Gartner, and we had lunch together while we were there, so shout out to him. But today, we've got Greg Dányi. He's the co-founder and CTO at P0 Security. So welcome to Identity at the Center, Greg.
Hi, Jeff. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time out, and thanks again, for supporting the podcast and helping us do this thing here. Why don't we go ahead and start with learning a little bit more about you? It's kind of tradition around here when we have someone on for the first time that we find out how they got into the wonderful world of IAM. Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
It was sort of a winding path for sure, maybe the latter. So I was in data engineering and ML, and then transitioned into engineering. And it was like more of the developer side and platform side that got me into IAM, actually.
So that's kind of a little bit backwards than I would normally hear today, right? Is going from ML and AI type stuff into IAM. I feel like maybe you didn't fully leave the AI ML side of things. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, I think, these days you just can't ignore what's going on, right?
Yeah, exactly. And now you're with P0. You co-founded that along with Shashwat. For those who aren't familiar with P0, give us a little bit of an idea of what the problems are that you're looking to solve for.
Yeah, so we solve what we term as runtime access control for humans, non-human identities, and also agents. So, whether it's about someone accessing a production system or, some workload doing its usual job, or maybe an agentic session, we will provide that runtime access and entitlements that these workloads need.
So that seems like it's pretty timely considering, what everyone's talking about with NHI and agentic, and we'll kind of talk about that. But, let me take a little bit of my contrarian CISO hat here, my jaded CISO hat that I sometimes wear on the show. We've got a lot of tools already. So if I think about things like, IDPs and authentication and privileged access management and IGA and role-based access controls and a whole bunch of, other acronyms that we kind of use to describe how we apply security to things, why do we need something new? Or is this not something new and it's really just kind of something that behind the scenes that people just maybe haven't thought about before?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. We get this question a lot. It's a little bit hard to map to some of those categories, but at the same time, I think we will have the best time in understanding each other if I say that we are closest to the privileged access management and the IGA space.
Okay. And then I think probably the thing that's really driving forward now is the idea of agentic identity and this idea of autonomous things that are happening. We really need something that is a little more speedier, more ability to adapt and can kind of control those sorts of identities. Is that a fair assessment of kind of what's really kind of pushing this forward? Is agentic identity really sort of like the kindling or the spark that is really, really pushing this forward?
I think yes. And I think another part of the story is just that because there is attention on it, right? Like I think AI right now, everybody wants to adopt AI, and security is kind of that department in the company that says like, whoa, hold your horses, like, right? Like we need to secure this. We need to make sure everything's tight. So it's kind of, in some extent, an impediment to adoption. At least maybe that's how it's perceived in many companies. So they have to solve the problem of securing AI, and it's already hard to define what that is exactly. Or it may mean many things. Identity is one of them, so that then drives solving this for identity as well.
So I think one of the risks that we typically see here is, we're talking an awful lot about agentic and the idea that these generative models are able to kind of do things that maybe people don't predict, and so in the old days, when we're talking about like APIs, which are still relevant, the behavior of those things were very predictable, right? It was this thing does this and only this, and therefore we can kind of control the risk around it. Now that we're talking about autonomy, that kind of goes out the window. So I'm curious, can you give me some examples maybe of like where an agent is maybe designed to do one thing, but maybe creates a risk that people aren't thinking about?
Yeah, I think even if we just look at like one of the popular ways that agents can take actions in systems is the MCP protocol. And if you look at some of the top service providers that expose their MCP servers, they do not follow their APIs. Like some do. Like if you look at GitHub's MCP server, it's going to be like open PR, close PR. It's going to be very granular. But for example, AWS MCP is like send me this AWS command. So that's very dynamic to your point, right? Like it can be anything, and that gives the power of AI, but also the risk of it.
So how much does that keep you up at night when you say, I've designed this thing and all of a sudden it starts to do things you didn't predict for?
I mean, I'm a very conservative person in that sense, in like from a security perspective, right? So I don't run a autonomous agent that can just go and execute AWS commands. So because of that reason, it doesn't. But if my company was doing that, yes. And we are also in the process of deploying P0 for P0. So we are doing more and more of this, where we can have maybe a more limited agent and more limited permissions and a more limited scope and specific task, still call this MCP server. Even though, the front grade is very broad, but we kind of like narrow it down to the task.
So this idea of runtime based access control, that kind of concept, I don't want to lose people kind of early on, but maybe you can help explain when I say runtime access control, how do you define that?
So maybe access control contains two things in our mind, at least, and I don't know what it evokes in you, but I think about it as authentication and authorization, where authentication is strictly like proving identity, and authorization is strictly your entitlements. What can you do once you're in? And runtime means that it happens, at the time of execution. So when the agentic session is running, or if we talk about a human, when the human is trying to do the action, like trying to migrate a database or something, that's when it's enforced.
So are we talking just authentication, or does authorization become part of the same access control, I guess, runtime access control methodology or framework?
It does, and it actually has a very big part to play. And we believe that authorization is the new frontier out of this equation, because authentication has been around. And like mostly, maybe we can say that we know what the solution is, and mostly companies are in a good spot in terms of turning on MFA, SSO, and things like that. But authorization is where still are problems. Now, I think more and more it's an existing token that's maybe stolen or exfiltrated, and then it matters what the blast radius is. I think both of them are included. We support both, and you can think of us as we will be very strong in dynamic authorization.
So if I'm thinking about this in sort of today's parlance with humans, it would be an ID and a password that handles my authentication. And then I've got, let's call it an Active Directory group or an Entra group or an Okta group or, whatever product, right? And that's getting my authorization. I'm kind of presenting that all at once.
Yeah.
Does runtime treat it differently? Do I do an authentication check first and then I do an authorization check after that? Kind of, if you can, take me a little bit into the details of how that works.
Yeah, absolutely. You're still a member of those same groups, and that defines your standing access. But we believe in a world, ultimately, in the ideal world, there is no standing access, and you get the access that you need. So if we take that premise and say, okay, now maybe Jeff is member of these groups, but they don't come with any access, right? It just depends on what you are trying to do today or what project you're working on the next month. And so that's the access that you express. You say, this is my intent. This is the things that I need to do. And then P0 will go and assign the entitlements, and not necessarily in the IDP, in some cases in the IDP, but most often it's going to be in the system where you're working. So if you're working in the cloud or in a database or in a SaaS application, then we will scope the permissions to your needs, which is usually much tighter than, I don't know, broad read or broad write access.
So I love the idea of zero standing access, zero standing privilege, nothing's out there. But I think, at least today, it's been hard for the vast majority of companies to do that. When we talk about agents, the first thing that jumps to mind is speed. And so there needs to be some sort of level of automation and orchestration involved to be able just to keep up with it, especially if you have an agent that has maybe multiple personas or multiple hats that it's wearing, just like a human being. And so that idea of, zero standing access is great. How do we actually make that real though for people out there? Is that something that, it comes through, the solution? Is it something else? Like, how do I just say, okay, well, here's Jeff's agent. And
Yep.
in this context or in this moment, he's doing this thing or it,
Yep.
depending on what pronoun you want to use. And then in the next 45 milliseconds, now it's shifted gears and it's doing something else. Like, how do we manage that?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, both technically and just or the orchestration part of it and the velocity of it. I just want to take maybe a quick detour and go back to the ZSP, because the way you phrase it just gave me an idea, which is that actually we are at a great moment right now, because agentic adoption, although everybody's talking about it, it's not quite there yet in most enterprises. Maybe it's going to be more like personal agents, but not autonomous agents in many places. And it's really easy, not really easy, but relatively easy to go to zero standing privilege, because agents don't yet have access. And what people give the agents is either their own access, or they have an NHI that's lying out there. And okay, why don't I give it that identity and the access of the NHI? But if we just at this very first moment can be strict about it and tight about it and say no, the agentic identity is a different identity, which has nothing defined yet in any of these systems, then there you go. Like if it has a different credential that has nothing attached to it in these systems, then you have zero standing privilege, at least for the agents.
And I think that's the scary part, right? Is if an agent is inheriting my access, that can be a real problem, because I maybe have too much access to begin with, or not enough, I guess. But isn't that the scary part? Is like, it's how do you tell the difference?
Yeah, exactly. That's the scary part. Yeah. So I think from talking to many people, we kind of concluded that, okay, agentic identity is a new class, not because it's, maybe different at the technical sense of a workload, but because you want to treat it as a distinct identity in your directory of identities. Like you want to be able to say, this is Jeff's, I don't know, local agent doing stuff, or this is Jeff's autonomous agent being triggered by, I don't know, a Jira ticket or something, right?
And that helps establish the audit trail and sort of the history, right? The record of who did what to what,
Yeah.
or what did what to what, I guess in the
Yeah.
case maybe.
Yeah. But I mean, it is hard. Back to the other question is like to do this at the speed and to decipher the intent. But I think the way this can be accomplished is you don't boil the ocean. Basically, you start by you're deploying your first agent, your second agent, and then you establish the best practices. And because it's not there yet, so it's not like you have to migrate a whole lot of things. This is the right time to start it out right.
I like that word intent that you just used, because I had a conversation with my friend Mike Kaiser at Identiverse, and the majority of our conversation kind of focused on some of the intent around some of these agentic identities. Let's talk about that. How do you determine intent on things like this? Are there different signals? Are there things that you can evaluate sort of at the runtime to be able to say, okay,
Yeah.
yes, the intent is good. It passes the check or whatever or whatever it may be that says, okay, this is okay. Or conversely, maybe the intent is not good and you need to do corrective action against it.
Yeah. So we try to, like from my ML days, right? We try to find an independent source or like an independent variable that we can say this relatively is not going to be completely clean, but this is the intent of the agent, and we can talk about how that might be found. And then these are the actual actions that it's trying to do. So now let's compare the intent to the actions. And that's one way of approaching it, like real time checking the action and like comparing it. Our approach for runtime authorization is that, yes, there is this source of intent, which we maybe know upfront or maybe changes as the session goes, but we can somehow decipher it. And then we kind of give it a lease, like give the agent a lease of access. Because changing entitlements in systems is not going to be millisecond latency. It's going to be, anywhere from a few seconds to maybe 30 seconds in some systems. So based on the intent, we will pre-provision this access, the entitlements, and then let the agent, there will be other controls perhaps inside the model itself. The model itself has guardrails around what the agent is doing and based on what input and the source of that input. But you certainly control with determinism what the blast radius is because you've only assigned these and these permissions to this agentic session.
So I want to help make sure I understand this. You mentioned using sort of a neutral third-party data source. Explain what you mean by that, because I'm not sure if I quite followed it.
It's not a third party. It's just as independent from the live session as possible, which means and especially from other data sources, like if you point the agent at a document, and somebody injected some kind of prompt in that document, that should not be the source of it. But it's really, in some cases, for headless agents that run autonomously, there is very often a description of the goal of the agent in the hosting platform. Like you take, I don't know, any of the big players and you want to run an autonomous, you have to provide that initial description. And that's a kind of independent source because we can go and with an API see what that intent of the agent is, which could be sometimes very broad, and that's the challenge. But for more narrowly defined agents, there will be an intent that is not going to be defined by what's injected during the session.
I have to imagine that's very challenging given the nature of these things to think for themselves, for lack of a better word, and changing the intent. Is it possible to change intent and communicate that somehow, or is this something you have to figure out on the fly?
You mean that change the authorization that maybe the session has on the fly?
Yeah, I'm just thinking like, again, kind of switching hats frequently or between different things that I'm connecting to as an agentic identity. It's got to be really challenging to try and figure out like, what is the intent?
Yeah, I think at least there are some boundaries that you can use. Like there are always sessions, and true. I think your point is that even within sessions, the intent can vary, and that's fair. But I think we start where we can. So at least you talking to an agent and me talking to an agent, those are going to be different sessions. So we can track at least a different intent for those.
You mentioned the L word that I was going to ask, and that's latency. It's always a concern whenever we talk about bouncing back and forth between yes, no's and policy gates, right, and decision points and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Is that one of the main concerns that people maybe come up with when they kind of think about, okay, how do we do runtime-based access control? Or are there other concerns maybe that have been shared that we want to address?
Yeah, approval is definitely that kind of latency of like waiting for a human to approve and just approval fatigue is definitely a concern. Latency to some extent, but also it's funny because what I've also seen is that because these agents are not sub-millisecond typically, they are thinking, they are like talking to maybe another agent and double checking and things like that, and then thinking a little bit harder. So latency of a couple of seconds is actually not that dramatic anymore in this space.
Yeah, I guess that's fair, right? You have the little box, right? It's telling you what it's doing. It's kind of thinking, and I see, imagine it's like, waiting for Jeff to approve. Still waiting.
Yeah.
Still waiting, right?
Yeah.
Or whatever, the approval mechanism looks like. So I guess that I can see that as being fair. Are there any other concerns maybe that leaders have kind of talked about? Say, okay, how are these controls kind of stack up and maybe slow down the pace of innovation, right? And I think this is where IT security in general has been famous for being the department of no. And it's getting harder to do that. So how do you stay out of, being seen as a department of no if we're trying to implement something like this?
Yeah, we have this concept of an evidence, and evidence can be that this action is okay to do or is allowed to do, right? And one evidence is that the user says yes. Another evidence is maybe that I do something and you say yes to it. But what we are building more and more is automated evidence. So things that we already have, like if you are on call, then we can look up that evidence that are you on call right now, and if yes, then these are the things that can happen, or these are the things that your agent can do. Or if there is a ticket in a ticketing system that's assigned to you or has specific metadata on it, then that's evidence. Or maybe there is a DocuSign document that exists in your repo, or other like existence checks in other systems, group memberships, and other things that provide us evidence that yes, this thing is okay to go and we don't need to wait for a human.
So that sounds like an awful lot of data that you have to be able to query, check, whatever word you want to use to say, is this thing valid, or even pulling it in as a signal to compare against other things.
Yeah.
How does that even work, right? Being able to do that. Can you take me a little bit into like how this gets set up and maybe step me through like just a simple transactions, kind of make something up or pull something that you've worked on?
Yeah. So for example, let's say that you are a customer service representative and you are working with a chatbot. Like let's not take the autonomous agent. There can be different people interacting with the same agent, doing stuff for them, and this is the helpful customer support agent. And then in any group, you will be assigned either concrete tickets, or maybe you will be assigned to a concrete customer and you are helping all of their issues. So what we can do is, what you will set up is, you will define that, okay, everybody can only touch tickets that are assigned to them. And then P0 will go and read it off your ticketing system, who is assigned to what. And then if you are interacting with the chatbot, then you can process the content of your tickets. Moreover, we could do things like, okay, maybe there's a customer database, like a data lake somewhere, which has like a customer column. Now you should only see the information of your customers. So then we can do filtering on the customer column value and say, okay, you have connected your Postgres database where you have all the customers, and there is this like one gateway where the one agent that can just freely write queries, because that's the power of the agent, to freely write queries. But now we want to ensure that like Jeff can only query data about their own customer.
And I would assume you can restrict the agent to, let's say it is connected to a big old data lake and say, okay, these are the guardrails around it. Because I think that's something that, at least it resonates for me, is like a lot of organizations have these giant data pools and they really struggle with, how do I filter what people and now things, agentic identities can and can't read?
Yeah, and the funny thing is that these systems, these data lakes, already have their RBAC and their very fine-grained access control. Like the Postgres example, there is row-level access control actually in Postgres. So instead of inventing that all over again at a different layer, what we do is we will create that create an identity in Postgres basically for that session, and give the row-level access control that ensures that even if the agent comes up with a very creative way of exfiltrating other customers' data, it will only be your customers that it can ever see.
And I'm sure the roles are always set up perfectly, and there's no like crossover or any problems with like bad role-based access control that have been put in place.
Yeah, but these are dynamic roles created by the platform, by our platform. So it doesn't have to be predefined by you. That's because otherwise you would have to set up, hundreds of roles yourself up front perfectly.
Yeah, let me talk about that little dynamic that you just word. The other D word that I like here is, so when you say a dynamic role, walk me through how that works.
Yeah, so for example, you create just one row-level policy in Postgres, which has a dynamic field where you inject the customer ID. And so what P0 will do is, in P0 there will be a policy which says, okay, now I'm linking the Jira tickets, either a tag in it or some information in it. I'm mapping that into that specific field in the Postgres RBAC. And so what P0 will do is it will say, okay, now you're given a role which has access to this row-level policy with this customer ID on it. So we are filling like, so you need to have dynamic parts in your policy. It's like you have a sentence, but you have an interchangeable variable part of it that is filled in from a different system, and that's how you can just define it once, but make it work for everyone and avoid having to like upfront define, as many roles as the number of customers, and then you have to track, like customer onboarding, offboarding, and things like that.
I mean, what you describe is a little bit like, sounds like Mad Libs. And so maybe we've just created Mad Libs access control. P0, you can
I
have
like
that.
that.
I'm sure I'm not sure if the domain's available, but that seems to me like kind of like thing, right? It's a policy, but it's got variables in it, right? That you can
Yeah.
change out based on, whatever piece of data or entity that you want to act on.
Yeah. And crunching the data, right? It can be sometimes a lot, or you have to. It's not so much the volume, but these systems have their own limits and their own quirks, right? So that's what that's the part that we have had to solve.
Do you think there's a spot where maybe agentic helps with that? Maybe a
Oh
translation
yeah,
agent of some sort that kind of like says,
yeah.
okay, well, in Postgres it means this, in SQL it means that,
Oh
and et cetera.
yeah. It does. It does help a lot in terms of like problem solving and development, and and it also helps actually customers in some sense, because if there's a system that we don't support yet, these AI agents or the AI coding agents can help and fill in like a custom SDK that we provide to them, and it's relatively now it's much easier than it was to build something custom on top of a platform.
Yeah, everybody's a vibe coder now. So
Yeah.
it's the
Yeah.
democratization of being able
I,
to create really bad scripts is growing.
I have coworkers who used to be coders and then changed careers, maybe in product or management right now, and everybody is back into coding, and everybody is coming at me like, "Look, Greg, what I have built." So yeah, certainly.
It's kind of like maybe like one of your kids, like my first app, and they're like, "Look at my code," and you critique it like a father. Oh yeah, that's great. But you kind of like that there's stuff underneath that maybe isn't as strong as it should be.
But it all works. Hey,
I guess that's what all that matters, right? Is the outcome.
right?
Is if it works, it works. Doesn't matter how it got there. The idea of agentic identity means that it is doing its own things autonomously. You mentioned earlier on that you're, fairly conservative when it comes to things like that. What is the line that you're seeing being drawn with at least your customers that say, okay, here's what we're comfortable with letting be truly and fully autonomous versus the things that we still want to have human control or oversight over?
I think um, one such line is still the classic, like, I don't know, CRUD operations. Like, can it read, or can it also write, or can it also delete? Is it destructive? So very often I see that delineation where they say, "Oh yeah, it's okay for the agent to collect all sorts of information, but I don't want it to act in the sense of like overwriting data or dropping data." Um, so that's one way that some people think about it. The other I have seen is that they think about what their crown jewels are, because even some reading some data, some of them is very important, and they just say, "Oh no, like the agent is never going to read this S3 bucket because that's contains PII," or so they think about like, okay, these are the most important things that I need to make sure that agent doesn't see it because I cannot yet secure it properly.
Meaning the data going into the agentic model or knowledge base, whatever it may be, or something else.
Yeah, it may go into the agentic knowledge base, but I'm not only thinking about necessarily, I don't know, upload it to an agentic platform or service provider, but like maybe because of an attack, if the agent sees this, it might put it in a place where it's not supposed to be. So not necessarily or maybe that's what you were also referring to, but it's not necessarily like going into the big brain, but also just going to the wrong place.
Yeah, I think it's a concern I see an awful lot is, where is this data going? How is it being used? And how do I make sure that my company data
Hmm.
stays in my sphere of
Hmm.
control, whatever
Right.
that looks like?
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly top concern. I mean, if you ask our own AI policy, it's also like one of the top things. Like we need to make sure that it's not something where some link can pop up and it's publicly accessible and there, right? Or somebody asks a question and suddenly all of that information is given back to another user for sure.
It's the modern version of the AWS S3 bucket that's been left without a password on it that
Yeah.
anybody can look at.
Yeah.
We talk an awful lot about like hallucinations and sort of, data being either incorrectly interpreted or, output. I don't want to really go down that route because I think there's probably plenty of conversation around that. But a lot of what we've been talking about today is sort of like what can an agentic autonomous identity actually do? And you mentioned things like CRUD, right? Create, read, update, delete. What do you think are some of the other security concerns that people haven't really thought about yet that maybe people are underestimating?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, yeah, prompt injection, data exfiltration is definitely top. Um, Maybe the commonality in the things that people worry about is that they assume malicious intent. Like these things really assume that, okay, someone like a bad actor is going to come, I don't know, put out some in a public place something bad, and they are counting on your agent reading that. Um, but I think a lot of things can happen just out of normal usage, and maybe that's if you ask me, maybe that's the part that's underestimated. I think more recently we heard of context drift, but even just fat fingering is actually really easy with approval fatigue, right? Even if there's a human supervisor, like a you just flip maybe a boolean and say you put a not where you shouldn't put a not in your prompt, and suddenly it will go on. Like I tested this out actually. I built an agent in a CRM system, and then I just told it to archive, all customers that are older than 10 years. Goes ahead, bang, does it. And then I said older, archive all customers that are not older than 10 years. Like, what if I make of course, maybe this is not a very natural example, but imagine that for some reason it misunderstands, right, what you're trying to do. And then it also went ahead and archived all my newest customers in that toy CRM. So just making mistakes like that is I think that maybe the thing that people don't think about.
So I think you just kind of expose one that maybe people don't think about it, and that is the human intent behind the direction. Not everybody is great at specifically directing what they want the agent to do, right? They kind of do it in, colloquial, do this because it feels squishy, right? And the agent has to try to figure out, well, what the heck does this mean? And what does squishy mean? And maybe it gets it right, and maybe it doesn't. But I think the human intent now behind it of being able to give explicit, clear direction can also be a risk, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, because you get so used to the power of this system that you just tend to become more and more lax around your descriptions and prompts for sure.
Yeah, I've certainly noticed I've gotten lazy, if I'm working on a little minor app, like fix it for me. Like, okay,
Yeah,
little stuff like that where it's like, fix what and what is it? And hopefully, it's only working on the context that I've given it, right? Maybe some little
yeah.
basic HTML app or something like that. But that, again,
And
that
have
intent generation and that deciphering is a challenge.
and have you tried voice control? What that leads to?
Yeah, I would say my experience has been mixed depending on what I'm trying to say. And, you know, people speak not perfect all the time, right? And it's okay,
Yeah.
well, turn off this light. Or no, not that light. I mean, this one, right? You just think about like how you interact with like some of your, home assistant
Right.
type things. Can you imagine now with something that could actually be destructive? Like, oh boy.
Yeah, yeah. I can echo that.
So when we think about customer environments here, um, as you've had these conversations with all your different clients and things like that, is there something that surprises you? Like when you go and start talking to people or start like digging into like, okay, let's get this thing set up and kind of get things going. Is there, something around the agents, service accounts, humans or non-humans, from those type of perspective? Like what surprises you? Or are you
Yeah.
jaded and like, no, I've seen it all?
I just wanted to say it doesn't surprise me anymore. But I think one thing that definitely still sometimes surprises me is that, and I need to remind myself again and again, that organizational knowledge about how things are set up and how things are working and what technologies are used is very fragmented. And so it always surprises me how many different parties we need to talk to actually understand the landscape and the most important, maybe the crown jewels and how those are set up. And um, it's and just to get things accurate, like, because somebody might know something, but it's, maybe outdated. So when we get to the point of implementation and then it turns out that it's actually not really like that, so that can still surprise me sometimes, but maybe less now than in the beginning.
I feel like that's probably one that people listening or watching this are going to be like, yeah, it's like, the guy who retired like 7 years ago, and yet, scripts are still running under his names and his accounts, and or the gal who like wrote all this documentation, right? And nobody else knows about it. And just like, yeah, you run into these situations where the tribal knowledge factor is such a very, very strong black hole to try to, or, try to escape from. Maybe this is an area where agentic identity is helpful. I mean, everybody seems to have like, a meeting recording bot of some sort going.
Right.
If all that data now becomes searchable and these conversations are essentially being recorded all the time, it wouldn't be inconceivable at some point. Someone's like, okay, well, how does this work? And because of a conversation that took place, 7 years ago, but it's now part of the data, people can piece that together easy.
Yeah, that's really maybe the equivalent of how you can vibe code in systems you don't really know, right? Like the agent will read all these codes and all these repos, and you can make changes. And now, you have the same access to like knowledge. Hopefully, if everything is captured.
One of my favorite things is when you're vibe coding something or you want to cross check it. Like I'll write something up in Claude, right, and then I'll have ChatGPT critique it, and then send it to Gemini, and you have the 3 different AIs kind of arguing over which ways. But we like this, but we would change this, right? You just kind of like you're doing agentic peer review of your data essentially.
I tried that and I noticed a pattern, and I won't name which particular agents, but it was like always I prompted this agent to write a plan, and then I prompted this other agent from a different platform to critique the plan, and it just roasted it all the time. It always says like it has these and these huge holes and gaps, and
sounds like consulting, but I won't go further than that in this conversation. Let's talk a little bit about the future here. Let's say 2-3 years, from now, how do you see enterprises really kind of evolving their control over AI agents and having it become more day to day? Because I think right now people are really still figuring out how to do this.
Yeah, I think one, like when I hear that question, the first thing that comes to mind is that I think there are already, but there will be more standards imagining or emerging and strengthening. Because it's still early and we see a lot of standards, but adoption is not very wide yet. And we always see these like cycles of, now it's RAG, now it's MCP, now it's local file system. So it's always still something else that really matters. So maybe I think that settles. And then I think there's also a cycle of first just let us get this thing going, and then we'll think about the security. So I also think that some of the major players are also going to come up with more of their own solutions around like, okay, this is authenticate. This is how you can do it differently, because there's such a huge need for a dedicated agentic identity, at least from the conversations I've had. So right now the model is really user impersonation. That's the number one, and maybe number 2 is a workload with broad permissions. But maybe there will be some solutions for these from the major players coming out.
Do you think this will move faster maybe than historical things like SAML and OpenID Connect when it came to like single sign-on? Like, is the speed with which this is growing really forcing how quickly organizations need to adopt?
Well, Jeff, you have to explain to me how fast that was, because I was still doing ML at that time.
Okay. It took a while. I think a lot of people think OpenID Connect is like the successor to SAML, but SAML still seems to be like the lowest common denominator for single sign-on, right? Things like that. But I just feel like because of the exponential growth that we're seeing with identities, and I've heard lots of stats, right? It's like, non-human identities outnumber humans 100 to 1, 150 to 1, 300 to 1. It's like, it seems like that number just keeps getting like crazier and crazier. And the legacy, ways that we treat identity around those things don't stand up. You can't manually, administrate and secure billions of identities. You need something that's more policy-based and more automated.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the standards are going to be faster. Maybe not on the analysis side, and I don't know if there will be standards there, but maybe, because there are standards in observability. So why not, right? But I do think it's going to be faster. And also, if you look at, for example, the MCP protocol, it started so basic, but yet there was adoption, because at least there is something to hang on to. So I think we will continue to see that.
So what would you tell a CIO or a CISO or someone that's similar, that's listening to this, that's like, okay, I really need to get my handle on this. We know we have to embrace it because the business is going to embrace it. And if we don't get our handles around it from a security and an identity perspective, we're not going to be able to secure it. So what would what piece of advice would you give those folks who are listening to get them started on their journey?
Yeah, I'm afraid they probably already know this, but I have seen that if I compare customers to customers, and everybody starts out like this, but it's somewhere along the way it grows into a bigger project. So really, the key is the successful customers that we have. They really started small, but had the decision to, again, commitment to tackle it. But they started out small and learned from tackling the first challenge, even if it was done imperfectly, right? So, they didn't wait too long to pull the trigger. They selected maybe a user group or a specific use case and target, like kind of treating it as I have internal customers, and I instead of picking them like maybe the most high value, I also weigh the most friendly and easiest thing to get going with, like also weigh the effort side of it. And then let's get started like that. And then if I have the commitment to follow up, then eventually I will get to the harder parts as well. But all too often, even if the intent is the intent, right? It's somehow, as more and more people get part of the conversation, it snowballs.
Yeah, I think small bites is probably the way that I would look at it. That's pretty common, though. I think from an advice perspective of anything that you're doing and trying to rolling it out
Right.
is how do you make sure that you're going at a pace that you can sustain? And it's okay to get smarter. It's okay to get better. Like
Right.
lessons learned. If I'm rolling something out for my team, hey, let's test it here internally and make sure things are working before you start to roll it out to others and try to make the process better as you move from there.
Yeah. Absolutely.
This has been a fun conversation, and I want to pivot and ask you some personal questions because
Oh.
we were getting to know each other a little bit before we hit
Yeah.
record, and you mentioned that you've got a couple of kids, and I want to focus on your daughter, who I think you said was 10. When I guess when you're having conversations with her, as you are about identity and access management, I'm sure you are. Does she understand like what you do? How do you explain what dad does to a 10-year-old daughter?
Well, what she sees is maybe not the level of identity and access management, but she sees that dad writes a lot of nonsense on the screen. And, I try to explain maybe the output of it. So I try to show like, oh, this is the UI, and you can interact with it, and I change this thing in this nonsense, and then this is how it changes on the screen. But yeah, I didn't get that far as the IAM portion of it, of entitlements and JWTs. I don't know. That would be a challenge. Do you have any idea?
Yeah, I mean, she can listen to the Identity Center podcast. I'm sure she would find it very entertaining. No, it's never too early to start learning about IAM, as far as I'm concerned.
I'll try it and report.
Yeah, let me know how that goes. I'm sure there's other things that you probably like to get into in your spare time. I think you mentioned like board games and maybe specifically, dice games with your daughter. Maybe kind of explain like when you say dice games, are you throwing dice in an alleyway, betting, college money, or are you thinking something else?
Yeah, no, I just think that there's some luck element to it, right? Like I like the thinking games, and she likes so we the more where there is some element of surprise that, oh, this, I never knew this. It's not necessarily that it's not a thinking game. It can be a thinking game, but she likes that oh, I never knew, and look, I rolled a 6 and now this thing happens. So we play things like Monopoly, or like there are some like games similar to Catan, where you do like resource collection based on some distribution which is not completely predictable, and then you need to adapt to the changing things. So yeah, those are the kind of games that we found that we both like playing.
That idea of chance is probably a good lesson for a child. Like you can do everything right and still roll a 1.
Yeah.
Maybe
Exactly.
Dungeons and Dragons or something like that would be like a good next step. I used to
Yeah.
play that when I was younger. I know we've got a pretty healthy Dungeons and Dragons kind of crew also within the identity space. So maybe that's a
Oh,
gateway.
okay. I'll keep that in mind.
Well, Greg, I really appreciate you taking the time here to sit with us, kind of talk through this, this idea of runtime authentication. I think that fits really well with some of the concepts that we've been talking about here around continuous identity. And really getting to that nirvana that is zero standing privilege, that always seems like it's the shining city on the hill that we just can't quite get to, but it is actually achievable, but it does take time to get there. Is that fair?
I think so, and I think again with agentic, the chances are better than before.
Yeah, because we're essentially starting sooner in the process, hopefully. And we know we can't rely on brute forcing it with 100 different IAM administrators doing this. That's not going to scale.
Unless you make those also agents.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the slippery slope, right? We can end up in an inception type territory where you've got agents, checking agents, and where do you draw the line and the level of trust? So, welcome to the matrix, I guess. Well, thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to have links in our show notes for people to check out. I'll have Greg's LinkedIn, so you can reach out to him. You can visit p0.dev/IDAC and kind of learn more about what they're working on. And definitely thank you, Greg and Shashwat and Yaj and others at P0 who are supporting the podcast. We'll go ahead and leave it there for this week. You can find us on the web, idacpodcast.com. And don't forget to like, subscribe, share, do all that fun stuff. Help us get great guests like Greg on in the future. So thanks everybody for watching and or listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.